Hey, RetconRaider here. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that today's video is dedicated to Mildly Nuclear, one of the folks generous enough to help support my channel through Patreon. It's thanks to people like him that I can keep spending so much time talking about Phoenix Point. That said, let's get started. With January coming to a close, it's once again time to look back over the past month and review all of the latest news about Phoenix Point. Unfortunately, things were a bit quiet in January. The developers at Snapshot are currently focused on the upcoming convention demo, which will be showcased at the PC Gamer Weekender event on February 17th. They're saving most of the big reveals for that event, so that means we haven't gotten much in the way of new images or official updates over the past few weeks. But that said, there are still at least a few things for us to talk about. Julian Gollop held an hour-long AMA session on January 22nd, and I've also assembled a wide variety of quotes from other members of the Snapshot team, including Alan Stroud and Kevin Hill. As usual, if you've been keeping a close eye on the game's development, then you may have already heard most of this, but hopefully I've managed to dig up at least a few things that even the most hardcore fans may have ended up missing. First up, let's talk about the mutant elephant in the room, the upcoming release schedule surrounding Phoenix Point and the various forms of early access that will be available. Now, the developers are still planning to release the game by the end of the year, and as the release date draws ever closer, we're going to be seeing some updates in the pre-order store on the official Phoenix Point website. Kevin Hill recently stated that the pre-order prices will be rising in the near future, and that they might also be closing the pre-orders for the Collector's Edition entirely. That means that if you still want to pre-order the game, you may want to do it sooner rather than later. Of course, it's still at least 11 months before we'll be getting our hands on the final game, but in the meantime, Snapshot Games is exploring at least 3 different forms of early access. The developers are currently planning to showcase a unique new playable demo at conventions, starting with PC Gamer Weekender on February 17th, followed by a backer-exclusive pre-alpha build and a more conventional early access program in the months afterwards. There's at least a bit of new information about all 3 of these upcoming events, so let's take a look at them one at a time. First, the upcoming tactical demo will not be available to the general public. Instead, it will only be shown at certain special events, though it may also be provided to certain other media outlets or YouTube channels at some point in the future. One of the very few new images released this month is this teaser image for the tactical demo, which shows what appears to be new Jericho soldiers fighting against each other. Of course, the developers have gone out of their way to obfuscate exactly what this might mean, but they've also made it very clear that the tactical demo will be rooted firmly in the lore of the setting. In fact, the next collection of short stories, The Briefing Number 3, will apparently include new information intended to set up the events that will be shown in the tactical demo. We'll come back to that a little later in the video. Now, the tactical demo will give us a much better idea of what the final version of the game will look like, including a lot of new material that we haven't gotten to see before. But it's important to remember that this is not, in fact, the final game. The tactical demo will focus entirely on a single combat scenario, in which the player will take control of a squad of new Jericho soldiers during a Haven defense mission. Kevin Hill recently described the tactical demo as being an updated version of the 2017 prototype, with new sound and art assets, as well as the game's simulated ballistic system, cover system, and destructible terrain. Julian Gollop has also mentioned that the tactical demo will showcase the character classes planned for the new Jericho faction, as well as some hints of the planned Nemesis system. However, the demo will not include things like the planned inventory system, stealth system, late-game abilities or equipment, or anything from the game's global strategy layer. Certain other elements, such as the potential inclusion of new enemies like the Charon, are currently unknown. Once the tactical demo has come out, the developers will be shifting their focus to the upcoming backer-exclusive pre-alpha demo. There are tentative plans to release this sometime in March or April, and it will be exclusively available to people who backed the project or pre-ordered the game at the luxury digital level or higher. Now, we don't know exactly what the developers have planned for this exclusive pre-alpha build, but Julian Gollop has referred to it as a limited version of the game's skirmish mode. Kevin Hill has also stated that it will be a bit rougher around the edges than the tactical demo, but that it will have more content and will also be constantly updated throughout the rest of the game's development cycle. Beyond that, the developers have hinted that Phoenix Point will also see a potential release through a more conventional, publicly available early access program before the game's full release at the end of the year. The details are still in the works, but it sounds like something that the developers definitely want to do. Another interesting bit of news that's popped up over the past few weeks is that the final game may end up receiving extensive DLC support. We've already heard about at least 2 pieces of planned DLC content in the past, that being the Living Weapon and Armor Pack and the Floating Phoenix Base, but this is the first we're hearing about other potential downloadable content. Now, obviously, the developers are hesitant to give us any concrete details this early in the development process, but they've at least given us a few hints about what they might be working on. This includes things like new character classes, new factions, new storylines, and even new ways to win or lose the game. The developers have also hinted at some prospective expansion or sequel material, though obviously that's all purely hypothetical at the moment. What's more, Julian Gollop has even stated that they're still looking at things like potential console releases or online gameplay, but for the moment, the developers are still focused on producing a dedicated single-player experience for the PC platform. Things like expansions, sequels, online gameplay, and console ports will likely be entirely dependent on how well Phoenix Point does after its official release later this year. So, now that we've spent some time talking about the vague plans surrounding the upcoming release schedule, let's shift our focus over to the latest news about the in-game mechanics. With the upcoming tactical demo right around the corner, the developers have recently started sharing a lot of new information about the mechanics they're planning to include in the game. This includes elements of both the planned tactical combat system as well as the planned global strategy layer. Some of this new information is relatively basic. For example, Phoenix Point will include variable difficulty levels, and there will be an optional Iron Man mode, but the game will also include a more conventional save system for people who prefer it. The developers have also definitively confirmed that the final game will include Ragdoll Physics. The game will feature a simulated ballistics system, similar to the one featured in the original XCOM trilogy. RNG will still determine whether or not the player accurately hits their intended target, with range playing a heavy factor in both accuracy and potential damage. Every single bullet fired will cause individual damage to whatever it strikes, even if it ends up missing the intended target. This means that burst fire weapons can be incredibly devastating, but may also cause a significant amount of collateral damage as stray bullets hit whatever else is in the attacker's cone of fire. This means that friendly fire is always a possibility, and the game will actually prevent your soldiers from making any automatic attacks that would potentially cause damage to friendly units. Of course, the player can override this if they don't mind the risk of potential collateral damage. The game will also be using a somewhat abstract ammunition system. The player will need to keep track of their ammunition levels, but the ammo display is built around how many bursts a weapon can fire, rather than how many individual bullets it's loaded with. The player will generally want to carry spare ammunition in their inventory, but if they run out, they'll still be able to potentially loot ammunition from fallen enemies. In fact, although it won't be included in the tactical demo, looting and inventory management are still intended to be a prominent part of the game. Each soldier will be able to equip up to 3 active items at a time, with additional inventory space for things like extra ammunition. Although it's unconfirmed, Alan Stroud hinted that there might be some sort of streamlined preset configuration system to make it a little easier to handle your soldier loadouts between missions. In battle, the player will be able to use a special inventory action to do things like looting corpses or stealing unattended items. This can potentially allow the player to do things like looting and immediately equipping a new weapon in the middle of a battle, or loading up on as much loot as they can carry, before fleeing from a battle that they otherwise have no chance of winning. Of course, it is important to remember that individual units will have limits on how much they can actually carry. This leads us to the work that the developers are currently doing on the character management system. Again, this is all stuff that's still being actively worked on, but the developers have at least given us a few clues about what to expect. Recruits may have several randomized elements to help make each one unique, and they will theoretically develop over time, not only as a result of training, but also as the result of both positive and negative experiences. As the developers have stated in the past, the game will include a character class system, with a mixture of 3 basic and 5 elite classes, but there may be elements of multi-classing included. Elite classes will generally be unique or semi-unique to certain factions, with the new Jericho Heavy Infantry being the latest example of one of the game's planned elite classes. The player's soldiers will all be unique individuals. The player will be able to rename and customize units, including cosmetic customization of things like armor and equipment. The player will also be able to acquire the mutation tech used by the disciples of Anu to further modify their soldiers, granting them a wide variety of mutant abilities related to communication, control, deception, and evasion. While these mutations are not always safe, they will allow for things like improved stealth and mobility, or even the ability to telepathically control lesser beings. Julian Gollop even went so far as to confirm that the disciples of Anu use abilities like this one to capture and breed mutants. Of course, as with the classic XCOM trilogy, Phoenix Point will include a permadeath system. If a soldier dies, they're dead forever. There will be ways to give soldiers an increased chance of surviving potentially lethal injuries, but these options won't always be available, and they're never guaranteed to work. It will be up to the player to decide if they want to populate their squads with expendable and easily replaced rookies, or more powerful but more resource-intensive veteran soldiers. At the moment, the tactical layer of the game is primarily focused on combat encounters, but the developers are currently looking at the potential for tactical maps with exploration or even diplomatic elements. Combat maps will sometimes allow for more subtle approaches, including an extensive stealth system which will be built around the evasion and perception abilities of each individual unit. This will likely come into play in some of the special mission types that the developers have hinted at, such as the special spy missions that involve sending a soldier to infiltrate an enemy haven. Beyond the tactical combat layer, the developers have also been sharing some of their plans for the game's global strategy layer. While the developers were looking at a potential turn-based geoscape system, they have once again confirmed that Phoenix Point's geoscape will instead use a real-time with pause system, similar to the one featured in the original XCOM trilogy. It has also been confirmed that the player will be able to acquire and manage multiple bases, but they won't actually be able to construct these additional bases from scratch. Instead, they'll need to locate and capture inactive Phoenix Project bases, which are part of the game's main storyline. Each of these abandoned or otherwise inactive Phoenix Project bases will come with an assortment of valuable facilities and resources to help the player continue expanding. The player will also have the ability to construct refueling stations and ammo dumps in friendly havens, allowing them to resupply their vehicles or soldiers while they're still out in the field. The majority of the world around the player will be randomly generated, making each player's experience somewhat unique. Upon starting a new campaign, the world will be randomly populated with faction havens, independent havens, landmarks, scavenging sites, and other potential points of interest. The game will then simulate a few years' worth of faction activity, to more realistically portray what the world might look like years after the factions have already established themselves in the game's post-apocalyptic setting. This will continue even after the main campaign has begun, with factions continuing to work with or against each other even as the player focuses on their own goals. Faction vehicles and massive alien behemoths will be shown moving around on the geoscape as they go about their business. Havens will be established, change hands between rival factions, and be destroyed, even if the player decides not to get involved. The intent is to provide the illusion that the world is constantly moving around the player, and it will be up to the player to decide when and where they want to get involved in the micro-dramas that will be constantly taking place in the world around them. It will also be up to the player to decide whether to work with or against the other 3 main human factions, and alliances are not intended to be linear. They will evolve over time based on a wide variety of factors. The player can even choose to go it alone if they wish, ignoring or even working against every other faction in the game. Of course, this also means that the aliens will be constantly working towards their own goals as well. While the developers are keeping the details under wraps, they have confirmed that if left unchecked, the aliens will eventually trigger an event which will end the game. The aliens will do this by building a series of linked structures around the world, and the player will theoretically be able to delay or even stop their plans by preventing them from doing this. That covers just about all the news we've received about the current state of the game's development. So now, let's take a quick look at the latest news about the game's official fiction. First, let's talk about the new collection of short stories that we'll be receiving within the next few weeks. This collection, known as The Briefing Number 3, will be focused on the new Jericho faction. The stories will be set in the year 2046 and are intended to help set up the storyline for the upcoming tactical demo. Alan Stroud has hinted that some of the new fiction may include recurring characters from earlier stories, and he's also stated that some of the material in Briefing Number 3 is being used to help design other parts of the game. There are currently plans for at least 2 more briefings after this one, with each one being focused on one of the game's main factions. Current signs seem to indicate that the Briefing Number 4 will be focused on the Disciples of Anu, while the Briefing Number 5 will be focused on Sanhedrion. New material from these 3 collections will include stories such as The Interrogation, The Good Life, and at least 2 more entries in the Deaths of Civilization series. Alan Stroud recently revealed that while the stories in the briefings are currently exclusive to the official newsletter, they will eventually be added to the Phoenix Archive section of the official website. He's also hinted that the developers are currently looking into providing audio readings of at least some of the short stories. Before we wrap things up, here are 2 new pieces of concept art that recently popped up. These are both by Svetoslav Petrov, one of the concept artists working on Phoenix Point. Petrov is the artist behind several of the more iconic creatures in the Phoenix Point universe, including the Crabman, the Crab Queen, and the Behemoth. These new pictures depict creatures that have been labeled as the Centaur and the Crawler, respectively. Of course, before you get too excited, it's worth noting that these may actually be creature concepts that were rejected by the Phoenix Point design team. As with many pieces of concept art, there's no guarantee that they'll actually make it into the final game. And that's it. That covers pretty much everything we've learned about Phoenix Point over the past month. I know, it's not much. Like I said when we first started, this was a relatively quiet month because the developers are currently hard at work on the content planned for February and March. On the bright side, that means we'll have plenty to talk about over the next few months. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official Facebook page, the official YouTube channel, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. Links are in the description.